and welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. Here we are on April 18th, 2019, the day that may live in infamy. Yes, I am talking about the Mueller Report, or Mueller Report. Bob Mueller has released his report to the Attorney General last month, and the Attorney General made a redacted version available to the public today. Now, here at North Star Oasis, we're not going to delve too much into it because it's a 400-page report that was only released just a couple of hours before taping this episode. So we have not had time. We have not had any time to really be able to go in. But we will give you just a tiny little snippet, starting with some of the key moments from when the Attorney General, Bob Barr, spoke this morning.
As the special counsel report makes clear, the Russian government sought to interfere in our election process. But thanks to the special counsel's thorough investigation, we now know that the Russian operatives who perpetrated these schemes did not have the cooperation of President Trump or the Trump campaign. The report details efforts by the Internet Research Agency, a Russian company with close ties to the Russian government, to sow social discord among American voters through disinformation and social media operations. The special counsel found no evidence that any American, including anyone associated with the Trump campaign, conspired or coordinated with the Russian government or the IRA in this illegal scheme. The special counsel's investigation also examined Russian efforts to publish stolen emails and documents on the Internet. The special counsel found that after the GRU disseminated some of the stolen documents to entities that it controlled, DC Leaks and Guccifer 2, the GRU transferred some of the stolen materials to WikiLeaks for publication. WikiLeaks then made a series of document dumps. Under applicable law, publication of these types of material would not be criminal unless the publisher also participated in the underlying hacking conspiracy. Here, too, the special counsel's report did not find that any person associated with the Trump campaign illegally participated in the dissemination of the materials. After finding no underlying collusion with Russia, the special counsel's report goes on to consider whether certain actions of the president could amount to obstruction of the special counsel's investigation. The special counsel did not make a traditional prosecutorial judgment regarding this allegation. Instead, the report recounts 10 episodes involving the president and discusses potential legal theories for connecting those activities to the elements of an obstruction offense. And as the special counsel's report acknowledges, there is substantial evidence to show that the president was frustrated and angered by his sincere belief that the investigation was undermining his presidency, propelled by his political opponents, and fueled by illegal leaks. Nonetheless, the White House fully cooperated with the special counsel's investigation. But again, the special counsel's report did not find any evidence that members of the Trump campaign or anyone associated with the campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government in these hacking operations. In other words, there was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking.
And they're having a good day. I'm having.
So there you have it. No collusion, none whatsoever. Might be a little bit on the obstruction of justice charges. However, the thing is, a lot of it just was born out of frustration, and the White House fully cooperated in the investigation. So there you have it. After 2.5 years of hearing how Mueller's going to get Trump and Trump's days are numbered and impeach 45, there's no collusion. This came right out of the very person who conducted the investigation. Not Bob Barr, but from his report. Here is President Trump's reaction.
And they're having a good day. I'm having a good day, too. It was called No Collusion, No Obstruction. I'm having a good day. There never was, by the way, and there never will be. And we do have to get to the bottom of these things, I will say. And this should never happen. I say this in front of my friends, wounded warriors, and I just call them warriors because we just shook hands and they look great. They look so good and so beautiful. But I say it in front of my friends, this should never happen to another president again. This hoax, this should never happen to another president again. Thank you.
And he's absolutely right. This should never happen. So now, one of the key people who got him elected in 2016 was Kellyanne Conway, and she is still a Trump advisor. What does Kellyanne Conway have to say about this now that the Mueller report vindicates the Trump administration? Let's find out.
I called it a political proctology exam. Actually, the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General in the original 4-page memo said that they found no basis for obstruction. And you know he's been cleared. Look, this is the Mueller report, Mueller investigation. Mueller's team helped with the redactions. So all of you who have been talking about how wonderful the Mueller team and how important it was to protect Mueller, how important it was to protect the investigation, how important it was to protect the Deputy Attorney General. That report makes very clear that this White House and this President and none of us got in their way, never refused to comply with a request. Lots of people went over there and testified, many documents produced, and that the Department of Justice has made very clear that every request that they issued was actually responded to and fulfilled. That should make people feel very good about democracy. It should make them feel really great that a campaign that I managed to its successful end did not collude with any Russians. We're accepting apologies today, too, for anybody who feels the grace in offering them. There was no collusion, and there certainly was no criminal conspiracy with any Russians. When I needed to find negative information about about Hillary Clinton and how to beat her, I looked no further than Hillary Clinton. Honestly, it's time to move on. Total exoneration. The president's in a great mood. And I think what's incredibly important here is that democracy in the world's greatest country, greatest democracy, flourishes. You don't need to collude with a foreign government. You don't need to get information from WikiLeaks. You can win elections fairly and squarely.
Okay, I want to actually go back and replay the beginning of that clip that we just watched, because the reaction from the media members surrounding will show just that. If you can play the video without the audio, keep my mic up, and then I'm going to have you freeze it in just a moment. Go ahead, Dallas. Okay. Look at the guy behind the woman who's looking at her phone. First of all, she's just spending more time looking at her phone. But look at the guy behind Kellyanne Conway. He's obscured right now. It'll be just a moment. I just noticed this when we played that clip. And in just a moment, he's going to step out from behind the woman in the orange. There he is. No, keep going. Now look at his mouth movements and his tongue, right there. You notice that? I mean, he's so disinterested that all he's doing is just chewing on his tongue. It's the most bizarre thing that I think I've ever seen in some of the videos. I mean, there he is. What do you call it? Chewing on cud is what cows do. I mean, that is what this guy looks like he's doing. You could definitely tell he does not want to be there. So, I just found that an interesting reaction. And then the woman who just continually had her hand, looking down at the phone, not paying any attention to anything going on around her. That's your news media. These are the people on the scene. They're the ones who tell you the news. But they're the ones who aren't even interested enough to pay attention to what a person is saying. Anyhow, we're going to go back to one more news clip here on the Mueller investigation. And Impeach 45 is not over yet, because the Democrats have not accepted, like in 2016, they have not accepted the outcome of the Mueller investigation report. Here is Representative Gerald Nadler.
Attorney General Barr appears to have shown an unsettling willingness to undermine his own department in order to protect President Trump. Barr's words and actions suggest he has been disingenuous and misleading in saying the president is clear of wrongdoing. The Attorney General's decision to withhold the full report from Congress is regrettable, but no longer surprising. Barr has so far refused to work with the committee to provide us with information, the kind of information that has been customarily provided in the past and to which the Judiciary Committee is entitled. These concerns and many others will be addressed when Barr testifies before the committee on May 2nd. Even in its incomplete form, however, the Mueller report, incomplete because part of it is redacted, even in its incomplete form, however, the Mueller report outlines disturbing evidence that President Trump engaged in obstruction of justice and other misconduct. I have formally requested that Special Counsel Mueller testify before the House Judiciary Committee as soon as possible so we can get some answers to these critical questions, because we clearly can't believe what Attorney General Barr tells us.
When you say that it's Congress's responsibility to hold the president accountable, does that mean impeachment?
That's one possibility. There are others. We obviously have to get to the bottom of what happened and take whatever action seems necessary at that time.
Now, isn't that the whole reason we had the Mueller investigation in the first place, was to get to the bottom of what happened? Gerald Nadler, if I recall, was a big proponent of the Mueller investigation. Now, obviously, we know that this is all a setup. This is the fact that we're Democrats and we don't like a Republican president. So we're still going to impeach him. We're going to bring it up, and that's just the way the game is played. But if you take a look at it, and you look at the way impeachment is actually written in the Constitution for high crimes and misdemeanors, it's very, very vague. And yes, the Democrats can go ahead and push forward for impeachment. That's their right to do so. They might even win the impeachment vote in the House. But like we saw with the Clinton administration, when they actually did get impeached, Bill Clinton won his U.S. Senate trial. The same thing would happen here. So again, the whole saber rattling by Gerald Nadler is much ado about nothing. It's, we're not relevant in this news story, so we're going to bring up impeachment just to keep us around a little bit. That's the way I read into that. But we're going to have, obviously, depending on any breaking news stories next week, I'm planning on actually reading all 400 pages of the report, and I'll be able to give you some more intellectual commentary at that time. So I'm only going right now today on what they've said in the press, what the statements are. But as far as the report itself, I have a copy of the PDF. I have not had a chance to look at it yet. So we will worry about that for next week. But for today, and something we covered last week, today is the 77th anniversary of the Doolittle raid. And today, actually, the funeral should just be concluding right now. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole is just being laid to rest in Texas. His funeral began at 3 o'clock Central Time, and right now it's 5 o'clock Central Time, and it's about a 2-hour funeral. So rest in peace, Colonel Cole. We had a clip that we wanted to play last week about Minneapolis connections with the Doolittle raid, but in the interest of time from last week, we weren't able to show it. So we're going to show it to you right now.
Here is the actual bombing of the mighty USS Arizona by Japanese.
Shaken by the newspaper headlines of the day, Jimmy Doolittle asked Admiral Halsey to go in closer for another hour and a half. Now the signal is back for takeoff. 10 hours ahead of schedule.
All right, well, it looks like we're going to try to play that one again next week once we figure out our audio problems. On my machine, my download, the audio actually does work, but for some reason it's not translating well to our equipment here in studio. So today is the 77th anniversary of the Doolittle raid, and we went more extensively last week into the intricacies of that operation, and again, we pay tribute to Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole. Anyhow, we are going to move on to today's Prager University segment. It's another topic that we've discussed in the past, but we need to take a look at the eye of current events and how the past might come again here in the future. Let's take a look.
The most famous fire in American history happened in Chicago on October 8, 1871. But it's not the fire that is so remarkable. It's what happened afterwards. To understand why, we first need to know something about the city's history. In 1840, Chicago was a small town of 4,500 souls. It ranked 92nd in population in the United States, yet only 3 decades later, by 1870, just a year before the Great Fire, Chicago was closing in on a population of 300,000, making it the 5th biggest city in America and the fastest growing city in the world. What led to all this rapid growth? In 3 words: location, location, location. Chicago was near the center of the country and near where the waterways and railways met. City historian Tim Samuelson notes, it was a perfect place for anything and anyone to get anywhere. Timing had a lot to do with it, too. America was moving from a rural to an industrial power. Chicago was right in the middle of the action. Ironically, its rapid growth was almost its undoing. Chicago had to build and build quickly, and so they built it out of wood, explains Sarah Marcus of the Chicago History Museum. It was quick, it was easy, and it was cheap. And as it turned out, very flammable. By most accounts, the fire started on the city's west side, near the DeKoven Street barn of Patrick and Catherine O'Leary. No one is sure of the cause, but it could have been anything, from vandals to a drunken neighbor to that clumsy cow of urban legend. Within minutes, the blaze roared out of control, tearing through Chicago's business district. The fire was so hot, it created its own tornado of flame. By 3:30 a.m., all hope of saving large parts of the city was gone. Nearly 30 hours later, the fire finally died. The reason? There was nothing left to burn. The losses were staggering. The fire claimed nearly 300 lives, destroyed over 17,000 buildings, covering almost 3.5 square miles, and caused damage of over $200 million, about $3.8 billion today. Roughly a third of the city lay in ruins, and 1 out of every 3 people living in Chicago, nearly 100,000 residents, became homeless overnight. All the law offices were destroyed, all the major hotels were destroyed, all the major department stores were destroyed, and all the major banks were destroyed, Chicago weather historian Tom Skilling notes. In those days, there were no national or state agencies to help. Chicago was on its own. What was to be done? To most of Chicago's citizens, the answer was obvious: rebuild, make the city better than ever. Yes, there were many victims of the fire, but there was no sense of victimhood. Even before the bricks stopped smoking, the people of Chicago went to work. First, the damage had to be assessed. The death and destruction were obvious, but there were some major pluses as well. The stockyards and meatpacking plants had been spared. 2/3 of the grain elevators survived. And most importantly, the railway and rail stock escaped major damage. This was critical because it would allow shipments of building materials and private relief aid to come pouring in from across the country and around the world. The banking community quickly rallied. Within 48 hours, 12 of the 29 banks that had burned to the ground were operating in makeshift facilities. Merchants, large and small, immediately set up temporary shops. Local financier Henry Greenbaum sent letters to investment bankers all over the globe. This wasn't the time to give up on the city. It was the time, he told them, to buy in. Many agreed. Among them were creative young architects attracted to the nearly blank slate the city presented to them. They would raise a new city from a new product, steel. Their work, praised and copied all over the world, came to be known as the Chicago School. By 1890, only 20 years after the fire, Chicago's population passed the 1 million mark, becoming the second biggest city in America. The population had more than tripled since the Windy City's darkest night. Why is this all important to know? Because the government didn't rebuild Chicago. Chicago rebuilt Chicago, and with astonishing speed and energy. A can-do spirit, devotion to community, and free market capitalism made it happen. It's impossible to look at this achievement without admiration and more than a bit of nostalgia. Could we summon that same spirit today? Yes, we can. But only if we proudly retell stories like this one that remind us the greatness of America is not a product of government, but a product of self-government, empowered citizens pursuing their own best interests. I'm Lee Habib, host of Our American Stories for Praise.
Now, if you've been paying any attention to the news lately, I'm not talking about the Mueller Report. The Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris burned on tax day. What was that, Monday? Now, even though it's smaller than the city of Paris, like the city of Chicago, Parisians are going to be are asking themselves the question, what do we do now? Now, we're going to take a look, first of all, at an overview of the time frame in which the cathedral at Notre Dame was built, because we're talking 856 years from the time it first was constructed. 856 years, and this icon is still standing. So we're going to go through the history of the Notre Dame Cathedral, and then we'll show you a little bit on the interior, and then we'll just keep this Chicago fire and rebuild in the back of your mind as we go forward with the rest of the show.
Growing up, we all have impressions of the Middle Ages. We read about knights in shining armor, castles with moats and towers. But when were the Middle Ages? The simple answer, the Middle Ages in Europe are the roughly 1,000 years from the fall of the Roman Empire, and to be particular, the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Empire continues on for most of the Middle Ages, but it starts in roughly 476, and it continues on for 1,000 years as we get into the 14th and 15th centuries. And it's really the time period that connects the world of Rome, Europe during antiquity, and connects it to the Europe that begins to emerge in the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. The Europe of the Age of Exploration, the Europe of the Renaissance. Now, what we're going to do in this video is we're going to look at maps of the various time periods of the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are broadly divided into three major sections. The early Middle Ages, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire till about the year 1000. The High Middle Ages, which was a high point for the Middle Ages in Europe, which goes from about the year 1000 to the year 1300. And then the Late Middle Ages, which gets us to the 15th century and is considered not that pleasant of a time to live in Europe. So let's just start with what Europe looked like right after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So as you can see here, this map is referring to the time period between 476, when Odoacer, or Odoacer, takes over Rome, and 493. And you can see the Eastern Roman Empire is still here, but the Western Roman Empire is now fragmented amongst many Germanic kingdoms. You have the Visigoths, you have the Franks, you have the kingdom of Odoacer or Odoacer. With the fall of Rome, we are entering into the early Middle Ages. Now, the Eastern Roman Empire, which considers itself the Roman Empire, its capital at Constantinople, under Justinian has a little bit of a last hurrah and is able to recapture the Italian peninsula. So it's able to recapture some of the territory that was formerly part of the Western Roman Empire, some of the territory in North Africa that you don't see on this map. But for the most part, Western Europe stays under the control of various Germanic kingdoms. So here we have fast-forwarded to the year 814, which would be right around here on our timeline. And you can see a major event has occurred, either on the map or on this timeline. You have Charlemagne, king of the Franks, crowned Holy Roman Emperor. On the map, you can see Charlemagne's empire right over here. He has conquered northern Italy, much of what we consider modern-day France, much of what we consider modern-day Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, and Belgium. Charlemagne is really one of the defining figures of the Middle Ages, and especially the early Middle Ages. As you can see, he's able to unify much of Western Europe. A lot of our ideas about kings and castles and knights begin to emerge around the time of Charlemagne. This notion of being a Holy Roman Emperor, because he's able to provide protection to the Pope. The Pope says, hey, I'm going to say that you are continuing on the legacy of the Roman Empire. Now, as we'll see, and we cover in much more detail in other videos, the title Holy Roman Emperor, or Emperor of the Romans, does not continue on with Charlemagne's descendants. But when you get to 962, Otto, who's a German king, is crowned Holy Roman Emperor again, and you continue to have Holy Roman Emperors all the way until 1806. Now, another major feature of the early Middle Ages, and you can see it on this map, is that Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries, it comes out of Arabia and is able to conquer much of the Middle East, Persia, North Africa, which you don't see on this map, and much of what we consider today to be modern-day Spain. And you can see it. You see the Caliphate of Cordoba right over here. You see the Abbasids here in the east, who also controlled much of North Africa. Now let's fast forward to the High Middle Ages. So here we are in the year 1135. On our timeline, that would be right about, let's see, this is 1100, that would be 1150. 1135 would put us right around here. And you can already see some interesting things on this map. The Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne is now fragmented. The western third is now the Kingdom of France. The eastern two-thirds are still considered the Roman Germanic Empire, or the Holy Roman Empire. And even though it looks fairly unified in this map, over different periods of time, it's really a bunch of fragmented Germanic kingdoms nominally under this Holy Roman Empire. Sometimes it's a little bit more unified under a stronger Holy Roman Emperor. Now, the other things that you see, and we saw it on the last map, is that the Byzantine Empire is continuing to lose territory. And you can see the Muslim empires, in this case it's the Seljuk Turks, are able to take even more territory. Now, one of the things that has happened by the time we look at this map, and it's not clear by looking on the map, is that you have in 1054 the Great Schism between the Latin Church centered at Rome and the Eastern Greek Church centered at Constantinople. And we have a whole series of videos on that and all of the factors that led to it. But as we get to the time of this map, one of the things that the High Middle Ages is most known for, the Great Schism or the East-West Schism is one of them, the schism between what eventually becomes the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church. But what the High Middle Ages are also known for are the Crusades. As already mentioned, you see how the Seljuk Turks are able to take much of Anatolia, much of the peninsula, from the Byzantine Empire. And the West decides to send what will eventually be called Crusaders to help regain land from the Muslims. And so that's where you see the Crusades beginning in 1096 at the very end of the 11th century. You can see the multiple crusades that occur over roughly the next 200 years. And the Crusaders were trying to reclaim land from the Muslims, and especially the Holy Land, much of which is below the map where you can't quite see it right over here. But it turns out that when they are able to reclaim some of that land, they don't give it back to the Byzantines. They set up what are known as Crusader Kingdoms, and you can see some of them right over here in this bluish color. So once again, you had this East-West schism, and the Crusades are further expanding the division between East and West. And that really becomes significant in 1204 when the Crusaders themselves sack Constantinople, take Constantinople from the Byzantines. So that's in some ways the point of no return. The Byzantines are eventually able to take Constantinople back, but this is really the beginning of the end for the Byzantine Empire. Now, even though the High Middle Ages are known for this tension between East and West, the Great Schism, even though it's known for the Crusades, most of which were fairly unsuccessful despite being very, very, very bloody for the Crusaders, the High Middle Ages were considered a high point for the Middle Ages. Farming technology, coupled with better weather, actually significantly increased agricultural productivity at this time. But then, roughly in the year 1300, historians consider ourselves moving into the late Middle Ages. So you can see here in this map, by the late Middle Ages, Europe is starting to resemble the Europe that we know in later periods, once we get into the Renaissance and the Age of Exploration. By this point, much of the Iberian Peninsula has been reclaimed from Muslim rule, although you still have Muslim rule in Granada. Most of the Byzantine Empire has now been taken over by the Ottomans, save Constantinople. Constantinople eventually falls in 1453. This map right over here is roughly what Europe looked like in the 14th century. So this period right over here, Constantinople falls in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire formally. And what the late Middle Ages is most known for is being not that pleasant of a time to live in Europe. In 1347, you have the Black Death, which by some estimates kills 50 million people in Europe, which is roughly 60% of the population at the time. It's also a time of famine. The weather cycles get worse, and even before the Black Death, you have a significant famine occurring in the 14th century. You can see right over here, between 1337 and 1453, you have the 100 Years' War between France and England, which lasts over 100 years. Once again, not a pleasant time to live in, especially Western Europe. But as we get into the end of the 15th and especially into the 16th century, historians consider that to be the end of the Middle Ages, and we start getting into the Age of Exploration and the Renaissance, which we will discuss in future videos.
And I'm sure we will discuss in future episodes of North Star Oasis, but not more today. Now that you see kind of the development of Europe, just a brief overview, stress the brief. Then you look at the 100 Years' War between England and France. It was around that time, actually just before the 100 Years' War, by about maybe a century and a half, when the cathedral at Notre Dame was built. So we're going to take a look right now at the cathedral in standing the test of time.
Hello and thanks for joining us for this week's edition of France in Focus, coming to you from Notre Dame Cathedral, Our Lady of Paris, the most visited monument in the French capital. Well, this magnificent Gothic cathedral was built in the 12th century, and it's been made famous across the globe through art, literature, music, even Disney cartoons. Well, as you can see, it is huge. That means that maintaining it is both expensive and time-consuming. We'll tell you more about that in just a moment. We'll also take you on a little guided tour. But first, let's take a look at how this cathedral was built.
The construction of Notre Dame dates back to the 12th century, and the legend goes that Pope Alexander III laid the first cornerstone in 1163. 4 stages of construction then followed one another until the middle of the 13th century. The choir and its 2 ambulatories were built first, and then the nave, side aisles and the galleries. The foundation for the facade was laid down, and last of all came the upper gallery and the famous 2 towers on the outside. The building work came to an end in 1250, but additional construction and adjustments were made until the end of the 18th century. During the revolutionary years, Notre Dame was the victim of numerous acts of vandalism. The spire was taken down and the statues in the Gallery of Kings destroyed. After the revolution, it was again celebrated. Napoleon was crowned emperor there in 1804, and Victor Hugo wrote a book named after the cathedral in 1831. The popularity of the novel sparked a movement for its restoration. In 1844, the project was entrusted to Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, who rebuilt the spire and installed the famous gargoyles on the balustrade outside.
Well, we're now at the high altar here at Notre Dame Cathedral, looking down on which are 2 statues, one of Louis XIII kneeling down, the other of his son Louis XIV. Well, to tell us more about that and some other historical aspects of this cathedral is Odile Pinard. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. Odile, just start by telling us, if you will, what's the significance of these statues?
Well, it's just because he's dedicating his kingdom to the Virgin and offering his crown and scepter to the Virgin Mary.
And of course, Louis XIII wanted to make some changes, didn't he, to the cathedral?
Yes, he wanted to, but unfortunately he died very soon, in 1643, so he hadn't time to begin the work. And Louis XIV, at the end of his kingship, did the work for the embellishment of the choir.
We talk a lot about the restoration of Notre Dame today, and there's a fund that's been launched to help pay for it. But it's not a new idea, is it? There's been phases of restoration throughout the centuries.
Of course, cathedrals need maintenance, you know. So in the 18th century, they had to rebuild the vault on top of the crossing, and they had to rebuild in the south transept the rose window. During the French Revolution, they had to demolish the spire because it had become very dangerous. And afterwards, there were other works in the 19th century and a huge restoration in the 19th century.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Stay with us, Odile, because we're going to be continuing our tour with you in just a moment. But this cathedral, as well as being beautiful, has a whole host of structural problems, but luckily help is at hand. The Friends of Notre Dame has been raising money precisely to address this long list of repairs.
It's a side of Notre Dame tourists don't get to see. On a guided tour like no other, with building conservation expert Christelle Garat.
It's in a far worse state than the north side.
Every year she inspects the state of the cathedral's facades to measure the deterioration of the windows, statues and gargoyles.
It's a lot more exposed to bad weather, wind, rain, even the sun.
Sometimes repairs are urgent.
We had to put straps around the statue to keep it in place.
Philippe Villeneuve has been the cathedral's head architect for the last 5 years. He says the building is in a bad state, as cement used in the 19th century restoration is beginning to crumble.
The stone is porous. The cement is rock solid, so solid that when water enters the masonry, it can only seep out through the stone, and not the cement, so the stones are getting completely worn down, and the cement seal remains intact.
Notre Dame's spire measures 100 meters from the ground. Its restoration began last year, as well as repairs to the rampart walkway, gargoyles and pinnacles, as part of a €60 million project over 10 years. The French government is covering 2/3 of the costs, but the church has to find the remaining €20 million and has turned to sponsorship to foot the bill. Cécile Passat has donated several €100 online.
I think Notre Dame is important for the heritage of European Gothic architecture, and we're also raising the awareness of millions of tourists by speaking about the damage, which they won't have necessarily realized is an issue.
Notre Dame has received 400 donations in the last year, but it's far from enough for Michel Picot, who's looking for donations on the other side of the Atlantic, with his foundation Friends of Notre Dame.
Notre Dame is the first monument that springs to mind when Americans think of Europe. They know the book by Victor Hugo, and they know even better the musicals and cartoons, such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Between 30 and 50,000 visitors from across the globe come to admire the gem of French Gothic architecture every day. But the church has always refused to introduce paid entry for tourists.
Well, perhaps some of the most instantly recognizable features of Notre Dame are the rose windows, which can be found at the north, south and west of the cathedral, this one being the western rose window. Well, here to tell us more about those and the repair works that need doing at this cathedral, of course, our guide, Odile Pinard. Thank you for staying with us. Just tell us first of all, what's so special about the rose windows?
First of all, this western rose windows has been put in place in the 20s, and it was the biggest rose window ever placed in a church. Before, in Romanesque style, you couldn't open such large rose windows. Now, of course, because of winds and rain, it suffered a lot. So as far as the 16th century, it has to be repaired. You can see some medallions. You have maybe only 12 or 13 medallions, really original ones, because of the reparation. But there is a meaning of this rose window, because the faithful could see it only when leaving the cathedral. And they were reminded to have to dedicate their life to Jesus Christ, who is in the middle, in the central medallion, with the Virgin Mary. You have a virgin child dating to the 19th century.
And I can imagine that repairing such a window is a very complicated business.
It is, and it was especially difficult in the 19th century, because during the 17th and the 18th century, they had lost the technique. So they had to learn again. It was a hard job, and they did a lot in the 19th century. It was a very clever job.
You've been a guide for many years now at this cathedral, Odile. Just tell us, is there one particular place in the cathedral that is close to your heart?
Well, just being in the crossing. And when you are at the crossing, you can see at once the west rose window, the north one, the south one. The west one is about those present days, but the north one is about our past, and the south one about our future. So we are immersed in eternity.
All right, well, Odile Pinard, thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you to you for watching. I'll see you again soon here on France 24.
So I hope now you understand, if you haven't paid attention to it before, the significance behind the cathedral at Notre Dame. because it is a very, very significant historical site. And of course, as we're going to show you in the next clip, we almost lost it. We came very close to losing it. A huge, important cultural artifact was almost burned. Thankfully, it was still spared structurally. Let's take a look.
There is a fire burning at the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris. Firefighters have been battling flames at the iconic church. Emergency officials are clearing everyone from the area. This church is 850 years old. It's visited by 12 million people every year. If you've been to Paris, you no doubt have stopped by to have a look at this church. Right now it is on fire. A significant number of firefighters and emergency crew are at this church in Paris. We just showed the image from earlier of that spire collapsing. What a sight that was to see. So you could sort of see it there through the smoke of the spire just falling onto its side and collapsing at that church. What a terrible sight.
From what I'm hearing, the people gathered currently around Notre Dame, just people in shock and really a lot of tears. People just, repeating, it's gone. There's so much gone. Since, as you were pointing out earlier, that moment when the spire actually collapsed, really a marking moment, people, for saying really like what is left now. That's such a massive part of our city, because it's our skyline as well. From so many parts of the city, you can see that spire of Notre Dame. It looks horrifyingly like a worryingly amount. And listening to an historian speaking earlier, he simply pointed out that if the roof goes, you then have to call into question the entire structure of the building. The whole structure is in jeopardy. It could take decades to get this building anywhere close to back to its former glory. And already its former glory was in question. We had been seeing those renovations, 11 million euros worth of renovations. 2022 was going to be the unveiling of Notre Dame back as it should have been, and this fire, which is lighting up Paris' sky, just looks like it's taken it decades in the wrong direction.
Having reached the grand...
So that's what happened. Now again, it's very fortunate that the entire structure, there's still some structural integrity with the walls. Now, I do recall hearing shortly after this happened that the interior wood, when it was first constructed, took 54 acres of trees. That's how much wood was in the cathedral. Wow, that's a lot of wood. So it may set us back decades, but keep this in mind. It took a couple of centuries for it to get built. So in the long historical timeline of the cathedral at Notre Dame, it's 856 years. So if it takes 20, 30, 40 years to recover from the fire, and it sticks around for another 850 years, this moment that we're seeing right now is just going to be the blink of an eye. Now, what caused the fire? We don't know. There have been a lot of reports in the last couple of weeks leading up to this of a lot of Catholic churches in France being hit with arson. Is this one of them? But then you have the whole construction issue. And as we know, it's been undergoing renovations for a while. And there were no construction workers present that I've been able to hear at the time that the flames first started. So exactly what happened, I hope that investigators will find out, and I hope they'll be able to release factual information to the public. It would be nice to understand what the cause was. But the fact remains that in order to move forward with a cultural artifact, it's going to require a lot of help from a lot of people. Thankfully, Disney stepped up with a $5 million gift. There's some French billionaires who have offered hundreds of millions of euros, but French authorities are saying that this is probably just the starting point, that it might cost up to $2.6 billion US for the renovations to be fully paid for. So there's an appeal from French authorities to US donors, and if you feel inclined to want to give to this effort, it's all up to you. I'm not here to make a sympathetic appeal, but at the same time, I'm not here to discourage you from doing so either. The only thing I hope that we can see from the French government and the Catholic Church is that when they rebuild the spire and they have to go back and do the new architectural drawings, that they keep it in the same manner that it used to be. I've already heard some horror stories from the Louvre, the museum in Paris, and how that's all been modernized, and that the French have already said that they want architects to design the new spire. Again, I just hope that they can keep it close to the original. That would be nice. But let's take a look at the appeal to U.S. donors.
Having reached the grand old age of 855, Paris's Notre Dame is in need of some serious renovations. Here, the cathedral roof shows the damage done by the passing of time.
Sculptures like this one are in a state of disrepair. This wearing away is the effect of pollution over time. Now we see here more possible degradation when you tap there, just below. When we see this kind of thing, we absolutely have to act on it.
The renovation work will cost nearly 60 million euros over 10 years. The French government will finance the first 40. To raise the remaining funds, tourists visiting the site have had an idea.
Maybe you should charge people to go in a little bit of money. You'll raise it very quickly, the money.
Because we were surprised.
A lot of people want to go.
We were happy to pay.
€5?
If it's necessary money to support it, yes, I would pay.
Payment on entrance is policy in many other countries, including Spain and the UK. Yet the cathedral rector says he does not want this and suggests a different approach.
I can call on French patrons and also search for patrons in the United States, so I think it will be found.
The restoration work done so far has been possible with help from the United States.
We have many American visitors, and they always ask us if they can donate for the cathedral renovations. So we created an organization for this purpose in the U.S.
A delegation left for the States on Sunday on a collection mission, with a second visit planned for October.
Okay, so when we put this together, I did not realize I grabbed the wrong clip. That was for the actual rebuild prior to the fire. So my apologies there. I will say this, just looking during that clip, that the Notre Dame fire has led to the inspiration for other donations. There's over $2 million has already been donated to rebuild burned churches in the American South. Then France's three richest families, they lead $700 million fundraising effort for Notre Dame. Yeah, the black churches in the U.S., that's from Louisiana. So let's take stock in the good that can come out of this. Because there's always a silver lining. There's a lot of good that can come out of this. Now, I know I'm going to hear people say, oh, well, there's all of this money that's going into a cathedral that can be spent on this, that, and the other. Yeah, that's true. But on the other hand, this is money that should be spent on this, that, and the other anyway. So far, it doesn't look like there's a lot of government money going into the cathedrals, and if the three richest families in France want to spend $700 million to rebuild a cathedral, by all means. Matter of fact, if you actually look at some of the great architectural works that were built in the Renaissance, in Italy especially, a lot of it was for millionaires. The families that had the money built the architectural works. It's kind of nice to see that in France, that spirit's continuing. So where do we go from here? We're going to find out as time goes on. In the meantime, my prayer, oh, and I forgot to mention that just yesterday, there was a guy who was arrested in New York. He was a New Jersey guy, and he had gas cans that he was entering St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. So is this an orchestrated attack, or is this a copycat? That's another thing that we're going to find out as time goes on. So, again, I ask, where do we go from here? I guess we have to take stock in what we have. We have to appreciate what we have. And I would have to say, if you really want to be inspired, check out some of the architectural works we have here in the Twin Cities. State Capitol, St. Paul Cathedral. Just those two off the top of my head. Heck, even the Governor's Mansion on Summit Avenue is actually a pretty nice piece of architecture. St. Paul Hotel. We've got some really nice architecture right here in our own backyard. We don't need to go to Paris. We don't need to go to London. We can just sit here and enjoy the stuff that's in our own backyard. Because you just never know when something that happened, you know, the fire that happened in Notre Dame, who's to say that something like that doesn't happen in St. Paul? I sure hope it doesn't. But it wouldn't hurt for us to go and take a quick visit to appreciate the beauty of architecture. So with that, we are actually going to leave you with Gregorian chants from inside the Notre Dame Cathedral. Let's take a listen. And with that, there's only 250 shopping days left until Christmas. For Dallas Pearson, producer, I'm your host, Jeff Williams. You're watching North Star Oasis. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.